right. So, when I was little, my dad used to tell my sister and I that if we learned Mandarin, Spanish, and Arabic, that we could rule the world. And while my dad was giving his lecture at every opportunity, my mom was always there to correct his grammar. My parents put quite a premium on communication skills for us growing up. My mom clearly believed in proper rules for communication, whereas my dad, being bilingual himself, believed that the more languages you know, the more opportunities you'd have in life. So, like a good type A child, I did pretty much everything they said. I learned 2 out of the 3 languages my dad recommended, plus a bonus one, and I improved my grammar skills to the point where I can now intentionally annoy my mother. There is, in fact, a grammar mistake in my first sentence that I threw in just for her. So if you saw a woman in the audience physically cringe on my opening line, say hello later, because that was her. Despite all their lessons with regards to communication, though, they left out something important. Maybe the most important. Something I had to go live halfway across the world to finally realize, and that's shaped me ever since. Luckily for me, I got vast exposure to different kinds of communication early on. Both my parents are academics, which meant that we would have summers off as a family, and we would usually use that time to live for months on end in my dad's home country of Greece. Now, I look pretty Greek, but I was not good at speaking Greek to start out. And like I said, I was pretty type A, and I was terrified of ruining the illusion that I was as Greek as I looked by speaking and making a mistake. However, I did quickly pick up on the fact that Greeks have a much heftier vocabulary of non-language than we do here in America. And by non-language, I'm not just talking about body language or gestures, I'm talking about everything from sounds to expressions to even intonation of the voice. Studies have shown that up to 93% of our communication is really dictated by those non-language attributes, so they end up being pretty important. One such example in Greek culture is this sound. If you manage to hear that with the little scowl I made, that's used to mean I don't know, I don't want to, go away, anything along those lines. Because of its broad application, it was something I latched onto right away. It would go a little something like this. Melina, could you maybe tell me what time it is? My parents loved it. But it worked out great for me. By copying all of those non-language cues, I was able to maintain my illusion of being Greek. And although that approach kind of halted my Greek language skills for a while, going back and forth to Greece from such a young age did allow me to start to notice and apply changes to my communication style. And that was something I could take with me no matter where I went. And I ended up going to quite a few different places. 5 years ago, I moved to Shanghai, China, and as you can probably tell, I was not going to be able to fit in Shanghai quite the same way I'd been doing in Greece. That 7% of communication through language suddenly became that much more important. Mandarin, as you can see, was a lot different than the other languages that I had studied at the time. And before going to Shanghai, I'd really only ever been exposed to it in the classroom. And if you've ever tried to learn a language, you know that whatever you've learned in the textbook almost never helps you in real life. Because in real life, native speakers have wordplay and jokes that don't make any sense when you translate them, but they use them all the time. I didn't know how to use Mandarin like this at all. Speaking for me in China was like going ice skating for the very first time. I could get from point A to point B, but nothing about it was easy or graceful. And I didn't even realize how isolated my lack of ability had made me until one day, I went to the fruit store across the way from where I lived in Shanghai, same as I'd been doing every day since I got there. Normally, I showed up with this guy who I had a crush on at the time, but he had recently left China, and so I showed up alone. The woman who ran the shop noticed me come in by myself, and she comes up to me with a smile and asks, "Where's your boyfriend?" And I have to say, oh, he's not my boyfriend. He went back to America. But then she asks me with a scowl, well, why isn't he your boyfriend? And even though she was just teasing, as I started to try and tell her why, I just burst into tears. I just started sobbing in the middle of this woman's shop while Chinese locals worked their way around me to get to the pears. And she immediately launches into that speech about how that guy's ridiculous and you don't need him. But, which was so lovely of her, but I was not crying because of this guy. I was crying because I couldn't tell her what was going on. I didn't have the words for it. I had never commiserated about my love life in Mandarin. That was not a chapter in the textbook. And the loneliness I felt because of such a simple obstacle was the ultimate frustration. Just as it's important to learn the proper way to use a language, it's almost equally important to learn how to break all of those rules for the situations that don't appear in the textbook. Gossiping, small talk, joking around are just as integral as is formal speech to everyday life. It took a lot of copying, a lot of listening, a lot of looking stupid, but I've slowly and surely found my footing. And changing my communication to this more informal style of Mandarin meant that I was actually able to make friends and ultimately decrease my isolation in a place that had felt impossible for me to fit in. Upon my return from Shanghai, I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I've learned 4 languages, I've lived in 3 countries, and I basically think I'm indestructible. So when the opportunity comes up for me to move to Calgary, Canada, I think, easy. Sure, they say sorry and a, but like really, what's the difference between the US and Canada, right? Needless to say, Calgary turned out to be the most difficult communication situation for me to date. Because in Calgary, I ended up overlooking an often underestimated but crucial point of communication. Context. One of my very first interactions in Canada was a dinner with my Canadian boyfriend's parents. And I go in ready to make small talk. We can talk about family, work, the weather. But the conversation ended up revolving almost entirely around Canadian politics. I want to pause right here and ask you guys when the last time you heard something about Canadian politics was that didn't have to do with the United States or Prime Minister Trudeau's face. Exactly. Issues I had no idea were issues in Calgary were brought up, and I had nothing to say. Like an awkward amount of nothing to say. People like to talk about what they know, but what they know is a direct function of their environment and their history, and I had severely underestimated how different Calgary really was. And I struggled with this particular issue for months upon my arrival there, because I wanted to solve it like I had in my past, by simply copying my surroundings. Eventually, though, I realized the only way to truly combat this was to become part of the environment. It was to put in the work, learning about things I didn't previously care about, so that I could effectively speak the language of Calgary. This simple effort really made all the difference. I now know way more about Canadian politics than I ever thought I would know, but by taking the initiative to learn about his family's environment, they ended up changing to learn about my history, all in the effort to communicate with one another. None of this should really sound new to any of you, though. As consultants, we are changing our communication on almost a daily basis to better convey our ideas to clients. But using communication to convey an idea isn't really the problem anymore. Ideas fly around the globe at faster rates and in more formats than ever before. But the problem is using communication to connect. Nobody lies on their deathbed wishing that they'd been retweeted or that a client had accepted a proposal. They wish they had a better relationship with their daughter or had more time to connect with a partner. I'm only 24 and I already have a regret like this. Remember how I was too afraid to use my Greek when I was little? When I was 11, my grandfather, my papu, passed away. And despite having lived over a year of my life in Greece at that point, I never had a full conversation with him. Why? Because I had been too afraid to make a couple small mistakes when changing my communication in the way that he really needed. And I missed my chance to ever talk to him, to ever connect with him. My communications professor in college told me something I'll never forget. Everyone communicates in the way that makes sense to them. We never walk into an interaction trying to miscommunicate with the other person. We merely communicate in the only way we know how. But we get a little complacent we forget that every interaction is a two-way street and we always have the power to impact our own side. Something I should have done way more of in Greece, and that I really tried my hardest to do in China and Canada and ever since. My parents set me up to think about communication as a skill that I could constantly improve on. But what they didn't tell me is that my ability to constantly change my communication is my true power. My willingness to change my communication not only allowed me to survive in these wildly different places, but it allowed me to forge relationships with the people that would truly make an impact on my life and my well-being. And it's really the same for all of us. If you're willing to look inward and break down the obstacles that exist within your own communication style, then you open yourself up to one of the few things we've convinced ourselves make life worth living: connection. Thank you.